Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the impossible letter, Harold's familiar loops and careful capitals spelling out words that couldn't exist. The paper felt real enough, slightly yellowed at the edges, bearing the weight of years it hadn't lived through yet. Her librarian's mind, trained to catalog and organize the logical world, scrambled for rational explanations that dissolved like morning mist. Harold. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Harold, look at this. But when she turned, her husband of 37 years stood frozen before a wall lined with photograph albums, his weathered hands hovering over one particular spine as if drawn by invisible strings. The afternoon light streaming through the cabin's moss-filmed windows cast strange shadows across his face, making him appear suddenly foreign to her. This man who'd shared her bed, her dreams, her carefully ordered life for nearly 4 decades. I know this place, he murmured, his words carrying an odd, distant quality that made Maggie's skin prickle. I've seen it before. In dreams, maybe? Or... He trailed off, pulling out an album bound in forest green leather. Maggie abandoned the letter and crossed the small space in 3 quick strides, her hiking boots echoing hollowly on the cabin's warped wooden floor. Over Harold's shoulder, she watched him open to the first page and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. There they were, 25 years old again, radiating joy on their wedding day. But these weren't the photos from their albums at home. These images captured moments she'd forgotten. Harold adjusting her veil in the church vestibule while her mother fussed with the train, the two of them sharing a secret laugh during the reception while Uncle Jim delivered his interminable toast, Harold feeding her cake with such tenderness that tears had sprung to her eyes. These aren't ours, Maggie whispered, though even as she spoke, she knew how foolish the words sounded. Of course they were theirs. Every expression, every gesture, every detail was achingly familiar and absolutely correct. Harold turned the page with mechanical precision, revealing more photographs that shouldn't exist. Their first apartment with its hideous orange shag carpet, Harold in his ridiculous attempt at a mustache during his graduate school years, Maggie organizing their first shared bookshelf with the same methodical care she'd later bring to the downtown library. Photo after photo documented their life with an intimacy that felt invasive, as if someone had been watching, waiting, recording their most private moments. This doesn't make sense, Maggie said, her voice gaining strength as her analytical nature reasserted itself. Someone would have had to follow us for decades, document everything. But why? And how did they get our private moments? Harold, who else has keys to our house? Who has access to our personal... March 15, 2003, Harold interrupted, his finger resting on a photograph of Maggie arranging books in neat, color-coordinated rows. You wore your blue cardigan that day, the one with pearl buttons. You'd just gotten the promotion to head librarian, and you spent the whole weekend reorganizing our home library to celebrate. Maggie stared at him. How do you remember that so specifically? I barely remember that day myself. I don't know. Harold's voice carried a note of wonder and fear. But I remember watching you from the kitchen doorway, thinking how beautiful you looked when you were creating order out of chaos. I remember thinking that I'd never love anyone the way I loved you in that moment. The words should have warmed her. Instead, they sent ice through her veins because Harold had never been one for poetic observations or detailed emotional memories. In 37 years of marriage, he'd struggled to remember anniversaries, let alone the specific sweater she'd worn on a random Saturday in 2003. Maggie flipped ahead in the album, pages crackling with each turn. The photographs tracked their life with documentary precision: birthdays, holidays, quiet Sunday mornings, arguments, and reconciliations. But interspersed between these familiar memories were images that made her question her own recollections. Harold holding her during a crying spell she couldn't recall, herself gardening in a dress she'd never owned, the two of them standing in places she was certain they'd never visited. Harold. Her voice emerged steady despite the chaos in her mind. We need to leave. Now. But Harold had moved deeper into the cabin, drawn to a simple wooden desk where more journals lay open like offerings. His movements held an eerie familiarity, as if his feet knew exactly where to step, which floorboards would creak, how to navigate the space without conscious thought. "Maggie," he called softly, "come look at this." Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee this impossible place, and return to their ordinary world where mysteries belonged safely between book covers, Maggie found herself walking toward her husband, toward whatever new impossibility awaited them both. Outside, the Olympic Peninsula's ancient forest whispered secrets in a language older than words, and somewhere in its green depths, their carefully ordered life began to unravel like pages torn from a book they'd never known they were writing. Maggie's feet carried her forward against her better judgment, each step on the creaking floorboards feeling like a betrayal of the rational world she'd spent 62 years carefully constructing. The desk Harold stood before was simple pine, weathered to a soft gray that spoke of decades in the damp forest air. 3 leather-bound journals lay open upon its surface, their pages covered in the same familiar handwriting that had adorned her morning coffee cups with grocery lists and anniversary cards for 37 years. "Look at the dates," Harold said, his voice carrying that strange, distant quality that made her want to shake him back to himself. "Maggie, look at these dates." She leaned over his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his aftershave, Old Spice, the same brand he'd worn since their honeymoon, and felt her world tilt further off its axis. The journal entries were written in Harold's careful script, but the dates made no sense. March 15th, 2025. Today Maggie organized the guest room again, even though no one has visited in months. She lined up the books by height instead of subject, which means she's anxious about something she won't tell me. "Harold, today is September 22nd, 2024, Maggie whispered. March 2025 is 6 months away. But Harold was already turning pages, revealing more entries from their impossible future. June 3rd, 2026. Maggie's arthritis is worse. She tries to hide it when she reaches for things on high shelves, but I see her wince. I've started putting her favorite mugs in the lower cabinets without mentioning it. December 24th, 2027. She cried during midnight mass tonight. I think she knows about the diagnosis I haven't told her about yet. "Stop," Maggie said, reaching for the journal, but Harold's hand covered hers, stilling her movement. His palm was warm, familiar, decorated with the same age spots and thin scars she'd memorized over their decades together. But something in his touch felt different, predetermined, as if this exact moment had been choreographed long before they'd ever stepped foot in this impossible cabin. "There's more," he said quietly. "About us, about what we become." Maggie pulled her hand away, suddenly desperate for space, for air, for anything that didn't smell of moss and secrets and the particular mustiness that came from books left too long in damp places. She backed toward the door, her librarian's mind cataloging details while her heart hammered against her ribs. 17 photograph albums on handmade shelves, 4 journals on the desk, 2 coffee cups beside the cold fireplace with lipstick stains in her exact shade of berry rose. "This is someone's elaborate joke," she heard herself say, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Or, "We're hallucinating. Carbon monoxide poisoning maybe, or some kind of spore from the moss. There are scientific explanations for shared hallucinations, Maggie." Harold's voice cut through her desperate rationalization. "What if it's not?" The question hung between them like a spider's web, delicate and terrible. What if their ordinary life, their Tuesday morning crosswords shared over coffee, their evening routine of his news program while she graded library volunteer schedules, their Sunday drives to the farmer's market where Harold always bought too many apples and she always bought flowers she'd arrange in the same blue vase, what if all of it was somehow less real than this nightmare cabin hidden in the deep forest? She thought of their house in Tacoma, with its mortgage paid off 3 years early through her careful budgeting, its garden planted according to her precise rotation schedule, its rooms organized with the same methodical care she'd brought to 32 years of library work. She thought of their queen-sized bed with Harold's depression worn into the left side of the mattress, of their shared bathroom where his electric razor sat beside her face cream, of their kitchen table scarred by decades of shared meals and quiet conversations. That life was real. solid, documented in tax returns and utility bills and the careful records she kept of everything from oil changes to anniversary dinners. It was a life built on choices, her choice to marry Harold despite her mother's reservations, his choice to support her career even when it meant relocating for her promotions, their shared choice to remain childless and fill the emptiness with books and garden clubs and quiet contentment. But as she stood in this impossible place, watching her husband read prophecies written in his own handwriting, Maggie felt something crack open inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the careful foundation of her ordered existence. Because underneath 37 years of shared routines and comfortable predictability, hadn't there always been a whisper of longing for something more? Some secret part of her that wondered what might have happened if she'd been braver, more spontaneous, less afraid of the chaos that came with real adventure? Maggie, Harold said again, and when she looked at him, she saw her own fear reflected in his familiar brown eyes. What if we've never actually been making choices at all? The question followed them into the gathering dusk as ancient trees pressed closer, holding their breath. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Maggie felt something fundamental shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The gathering dusk outside seemed to press against the windows with deliberate intent, and she realized with a chill that she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard a bird call or the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. The forest had gone unnaturally silent, as if the world itself was waiting. "Harold, we need to leave," she said again. But her husband remained transfixed by the journals, turning pages with the mechanical precision of someone following a script they'd memorized long ago. "Harold, listen to me. This place, whatever this is, it's not right. We need to go back to the trail, back to the car, back to—" September 22nd, 2024. Harold read aloud, his voice taking on that strange, distant quality that made her skin crawl. "Maggie will try to convince me to leave the cabin today. She'll mention the car twice and use the word rational at least 4 times, but she won't be able to resist reading the final entry, the one that explains everything." Maggie's blood turned to ice water. "Stop it. Stop reading that." But Harold continued as if she hadn't spoken. "She'll tell me I'm scaring her, that this isn't like me, that the Harold she married would never—" "You're scaring me," Maggie whispered, and the words fell from her lips with such perfect timing that she wondered if she'd chosen to speak them at all. "This isn't like you. The Harold I married would never—" She clamped her hands over her mouth, backing toward the door, but Harold's eyes found hers with laser focus, and she saw something terrible there. Recognition mixed with a growing horror that matched her own. "Oh God," he breathed, the journal trembling in his hands. "Maggie, I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to—" The words just came out exactly as they were written. The cabin seemed to contract around them, the walls pressing closer, the photographs watching from their frames with knowing eyes. Maggie's rational mind, the part of her that had spent 3 decades organizing information, categorizing mysteries into neat, solvable problems, screamed at her to run. But her feet remained rooted to the warped floorboards as Harold's trembling fingers found a different journal, this one bound in deep burgundy leather. "There's one more," he said, his voice barely audible. It's about you, Maggie, about what happens to you." "No." The word erupted from her with surprising force. "I don't want to know, whatever sick game this is, whatever elaborate prank or psychological experiment." September 25th, 2024, Harold began reading, and Maggie realized with dawning horror that she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but listen as her husband's voice filled the cabin with words that shouldn't exist. "3 days after we found the cabin, Maggie will—" "Stop!" The scream tore from her throat with such violence that Harold dropped the journal, and the sound of leather hitting wood seemed to break whatever spell had held them frozen. The cabin shuddered around them, or perhaps it was her imagination, but Maggie didn't wait to find out. She lunged for the door, her hands scrabbling at the handle, but the wood seemed to resist her touch, the metal cold enough to burn her palms. Behind her, she heard Harold moving, heard the whisper of pages turning, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she let him read whatever was written in that final entry, their ordinary world would be lost forever. "The lock!" she gasped, throwing her full weight against the door. "Harold, help me with the lock!" But when she turned, her husband stood frozen again, the burgundy journal open in his hands, his face pale as winter moonlight. His lips moved silently, reading words she couldn't see but somehow felt burning through the air between them like brands. "Harold, please," she begged, abandoning the door to reach for him. "Whatever it says, we don't have to read it. We don't have to know. We can choose ignorance. We can choose to walk away. Can we?" Harold looked up at her, and in his familiar brown eyes she saw a terrible question forming. "Maggie, what if walking away is just another part of the script? What if choosing ignorance is exactly what we're supposed to do? What if—" His voice broke. "What if there is no choice at all?" The question settled over them like a shroud, and Maggie understood that they had reached a crossroads that would define not just their remaining years together, but everything they'd believed about their marriage, their lives, their very existence. She could feel the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders, read the final entry and learn what fate had supposedly planned for them, or flee this place and spend the rest of their lives wondering if they'd ever truly been free. Outside, the Olympic Peninsula's ancient trees creaked in a wind that sounded almost like whispers, and the choice that would change everything waited in the dying light. The dying light filtered through moss-covered windows, casting everything in the cabin in shades of green and shadow that made reality feel negotiable. Maggie stood frozen between her husband and the door, her body a taut wire of indecision that threatened to snap at any moment. The burgundy journal seemed to pulse in Harold's hands like a living heart, and she could feel its pull, even as every rational fiber of her being screamed to run. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of her own thundering pulse. "Harold, I can't read what's in there. What if it's true? What if everything we've built, everything we've shared, what if it's all been predetermined? What if our love was never real?" The question tasted like ash in her mouth because somewhere, in the deepest corner of her heart, she always harbored a secret fear that love itself might be nothing more than biology and circumstance. Two people thrown together by chance, mistaking familiarity for fate, comfort for passion. How many nights had she lain awake beside Harold's sleeping form, wondering if they'd simply settled into each other's lives like water finding the easiest path downhill? But what if not reading it is worse? Harold's voice cracked with the weight of the impossible choice. What if we walk away from here and spend whatever time we have left wondering? What if every conversation, every touch, every moment becomes suspect because we don't know whether we're choosing it or following some cosmic script? Maggie's hands trembled as she pressed them against her temples, trying to contain the chaos spinning through her mind. She thought of their morning routine, Harold reading news headlines aloud while she sorted mail with mechanical precision. Had she actually cared about those shared breakfasts? Or had she simply performed them because some invisible playwright had written them into her role as dutiful wife? "I've spent my entire life believing in order," she said, her voice growing stronger as she grasped for the familiar anchor of logic. "In cataloging systems and rational explanations and the comfort of knowing that every book has its proper place on the shelf. But this," she gestured helplessly at the cabin around them, at the photographs documenting moments they'd never posed for, at the journals filled with Harold's handwriting predicting their future. "This destroys everything I thought I understood about how the world works." Harold set the journal down on the desk with deliberate care, and Maggie felt a moment's relief before she realized he wasn't abandoning it. He was simply freeing his hands to reach for her. When his fingers intertwined with hers, the touch felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like coming home to a house where all the furniture had been rearranged. "Remember our third date?" he said quietly. "You insisted on going to that terrible art film downtown, the one where nothing happened for 2.5 hours except people staring meaningfully at each other in black and white." Despite everything, Maggie felt her lips twitch toward a smile. "You hated every minute of it." "I did. But afterward, when we were walking to the car, you started explaining why the emptiness was the point, why the silence between the characters said more than dialogue ever could. And I remember thinking that I could listen to you find meaning in meaninglessness for the rest of my life. The memory should have comforted her, but instead, it felt like another piece of evidence in some cosmic trial. What if that feeling wasn't real, Harold? What if some force we can't understand programmed you to think those thoughts, to fall for a woman who needed to organize chaos into comprehensible patterns? And what if it was real? Harold countered, his grip on her hands tightening. What if the only thing that matters is how it felt, regardless of what might have orchestrated it? Maggie stared into his familiar brown eyes and saw 3 decades of shared history reflected there, arguments and reconciliations, quiet contentments and moments of unexpected joy. The slow accumulation of intimacy that came from choosing each other again and again, day after ordinary day. But now every memory felt contaminated by doubt, every moment of connection shadowed by the possibility that their choices had been illusions. "I'm terrified," she admitted, the words emerging as barely more than breath. "I'm terrified that reading what's in that journal will destroy us, and I'm equally terrified that not reading it means we'll never trust ourselves or each other again." How do we choose when either choice might be wrong? The cabin settled around them with a soft groan of aging wood, and through the windows, the forest pressed closer in the deepening dusk. Somewhere in the distance, Maggie thought she heard the sound of their own voices carried on the wind, fragments of conversations they'd had or might have or were destined to have, echoing through the moss-covered trees like promises or threats. The burgundy journal waited on the desk between them, patient as fate itself, holding secrets that would either liberate them or destroy everything they'd believed about their life together. And Maggie realized that the choice, if choice it truly was, would define not just their future but their understanding of everything they'd already lived. Maggie's hand hovered above the burgundy journal like a moth drawn to flame, trembling in the green-filtered light that made everything in the cabin feel underwater, suspended between reality and dream. The leather cover was warm to the touch, impossibly warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight instead of this moss-shrouded twilight, and she felt the moment her fingertips made contact that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. "Once I open this," she whispered, "we can't unknow what's inside." Harold's presence behind her felt solid and familiar, the warmth of his body an anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. "We can't unknow what we've already seen either," he said quietly. "The photographs, the journals about our past. Maggie, we're already changed. The question now is whether we face it together or let it destroy us piece by piece." She thought of their house in Tacoma, with its carefully maintained garden and mortgage, free deed, the life they'd built through decades of small, deliberate choices. Tomorrow, they were supposed to drive home and resume their ordinary existence. Harold would return to his volunteer work at the community center, she would continue organizing the library's historical archives, and they would slip back into the comfortable rhythms of a marriage that had long ago settled into contentment rather than passion. But that life already felt like something she'd read about rather than lived. How could she go back to sorting historical documents when she'd found documentation of her own impossible future? How could she trust any feeling or decision when the evidence of predestination sat heavy in her hands? "I need to know," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. "I need to know if my death is written down in here, and when, and how. I need to know if our entire marriage has been nothing but cosmic theater." The journal opened easily, its pages falling to an entry near the end, with the inevitability of water finding its level. Harold's familiar handwriting sprawled across the cream-colored paper, but the date made her stomach lurch, September 25, 2024. 3 days from now. "Today, Maggie died exactly as the cabin showed us she would," the entry began, and Maggie's vision grayed at the edges. "I watched it happen and couldn't change anything, couldn't save her, because every word I spoke, every action I took, had been written down already. Even this, even writing about watching her die, was predetermined." "Jesus Christ," Harold breathed behind her, reading over her shoulder. "Maggie, stop. Close it. We don't need to." But she was already reading further, her librarian's training making her eyes move across the page with mechanical efficiency even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She went back to the cabin despite everything, despite our promises to each other, despite my begging. At 3:47 p.m., she walked through that door one last time, and the forest took her just like it was always going to. No, Maggie whispered. But she couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop absorbing the clinical details of her own prophesied end. I found her at sunset, sitting in the same chair where we discovered the journals, her eyes open but empty, a smile on her face like she'd finally found the answer to the question that had been tearing her apart. The autopsy will say cardiac arrest, but I'll know the truth. She died from certainty, from finally understanding that choice is an illusion and free will is the cruelest joke the universe ever played. The words blurred as tears she hadn't realized she was crying fell onto the page, smearing ink that shouldn't exist. Harold's arms came around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth while staring at the documentation of her own destruction. "It's not real," he murmured into her hair, but his voice shook with uncertainty. "It can't be real. People don't just die from knowing too much." But even as he spoke the reassurance, Maggie felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest. Not physical pain exactly, but a loosening, as if the careful structures she'd built to contain her life were coming undone. She thought of all the years she'd spent cataloging and organizing, imposing order on chaos, believing that understanding led to control. What if the opposite was true? What if some knowledge was too large for a human heart to hold? The cabin seemed to pulse around them, its moss-covered walls breathing with ancient patience. Through the windows, the Olympic Peninsula's primordial forest pressed closer, and Maggie understood with crystalline clarity that she stood at the center of something far larger and older than her marriage, her life, her small human concerns about love and choice and meaning. "I have to go back," she heard herself say, the words emerging from some deep place she didn't recognize. "In 3 days, I have to come back here." "No." Harold's arms tightened around her. "We're leaving, right now. We're going home and pretending this never happened." But Maggie was already stepping away from his embrace, already turning toward the door that would lead her out of their ordinary life forever. The threshold loomed before her, not just the cabin's entrance, but the boundary between who she'd been and who she was becoming. Behind her, the journal fell to the floor with a soft whisper of pages, and ahead lay the forest, patient and knowing, waiting to teach her the difference between living and being truly alive. The forest floor crunched beneath Maggie's feet as she stumbled from the cabin, Harold's desperate calls echoing behind her. The Olympic Peninsula's ancient trees towered overhead like cathedral pillars, their moss-draped branches filtering the dying daylight into an otherworldly green glow. Each step felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible, as if she were walking through water or dream. "Maggie, stop!" Harold's voice cracked with panic. "You're not thinking clearly. This is exactly what the journal said would happen. You walking away, me following, all of it scripted. Don't you see? Even this could be part of the predestination." She whirled to face him, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Then what choice do we have? Stay and accept that our entire lives are predetermined? Go home and pretend we never found proof that free will is an illusion? Every option feels like a trap." The forest seemed to pulse around them with ancient awareness. Somewhere in the distance, Maggie heard the sound of rushing water, a creek or hidden waterfall that hadn't been audible from inside the cabin. The sound drew her like a magnetic pull, promising answers or absolution or perhaps just the comfort of something eternal and unchanging. "There's someone else here," Harold said suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. Maggie followed his gaze through the moss-laden trees and saw a figure moving between the trunks with fluid grace, an elderly indigenous woman wearing a wool coat that seemed to absorb the forest's green light. Her silver hair hung in a long braid decorated with small carved bones, and her dark eyes held depths that reminded Maggie uncomfortably of the cabin's patient windows. "You found the memory house," the woman said, her voice carrying easily through the stillness. She spoke with the careful precision of someone for whom English was a chosen language rather than a birthright. "I was wondering when someone would disturb that particular crossroads again." "Memory house?" Maggie's librarian instincts kicked in despite her emotional chaos. You know about the cabin? You've seen it before? The woman smiled, and the expression transformed her weathered features into something luminous. My grandmother called them waypoints, places where time gets tangled up with itself like fishing line. The forest is full of them if you know how to look. Most people walk right past without seeing, but sometimes— She studied Maggie with unsettling intensity. Sometimes someone needs to see badly enough that the barriers get thin. Harold moved protectively closer to Maggie. Who are you? How do you know about any of this? I'm Elena Riversong. My family has been caretakers of this land for longer than your people have had words for time. She gestured toward the cabin with casual familiarity. That particular structure has been showing visitors their own threads for maybe 70 years now. Always the same pattern. People find what they think are predictions, get caught up trying to figure out if they were trapped or free, and usually end up proving the prophecies true through their very attempts to escape them. Maggie felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. Usually? You mean this has happened to other people? Other couples have found journals about their own deaths? Deaths, divorces, disasters. The specifics change, but the mechanism stays the same. Elena moved closer, her footsteps silent on the moss-covered ground. The memory house doesn't predict the future, child. It shows you the shape of your own expectations, your deepest fears about what your life means. The journals aren't prophecy, they're mirrors. But the handwriting, Harold protested, pulling the burgundy journal from his jacket pocket. This is definitely my handwriting. I know my own— Is it? Elena interrupted gently. Or is it what you expect your handwriting should look like when documenting the worst thing you can imagine? Fear has its own calligraphy. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She thought of all the years she'd spent cataloging other people's stories, organizing historical documents that captured humanity's endless capacity for creating meaning from chaos. What if the cabin had simply taken her deepest terror? That love was illusion, that choice was predetermined, that her carefully ordered life was ultimately meaningless, and reflected it back in the most convincing form possible. But the photographs, she whispered, all those moments we never posed for. The memory house is very thorough, Elena said with something that might have been sympathy. It feeds on doubt and builds elaborate justifications for hopelessness. The question is whether you're going to let it convince you that love is scripted, or whether you're brave enough to choose meaning in spite of uncertainty. The forest held its breath around them, waiting. In the distance, that hidden water continued its eternal song, and Maggie realized she stood at the true crossroads, not between destiny and free will, but between despair and the terrifying possibility that their love might be real precisely because it persisted despite doubt. The choice, she understood now, had always been hers to make. The weight of Elena's words settled around Maggie like a physical presence, but instead of relief, she felt something darker taking root in her chest, a terrible hunger to know for certain, to push past doubt into absolute truth, no matter the cost. The burgundy journal in Harold's hands seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, calling to her like an addiction she'd only just discovered. You're saying it's all fabrication, Maggie said slowly, her librarian's mind dissecting Elena's explanation with clinical precision. That the cabin creates elaborate fictions based on our psychological profiles, feeds us convincing lies wrapped in familiar handwriting and impossible photographs. Elena nodded, her dark eyes never leaving Maggie's face. The memory house reflects what you bring to it. Fear, doubt, the need to find patterns even in chaos. But what if you're wrong? The words erupted from Maggie with startling violence. What if you're just another part of the test, another layer of the illusion designed to make me doubt what I've seen? What if walking away now means I'll spend the next 3 days waiting for my heart to stop, wondering if every breath might be scripted? Harold stepped between them, his face pale in the forest's green twilight. Maggie, listen to yourself. You're talking about going back to that place, about testing whether a prophecy of your own death is real. That's not rational thought, that's obsession. She laughed, and the sound that emerged was sharp enough to cut. Rational. Harold, nothing about today has been rational. Our wedding photos scattered across a table we've never seen, journals documenting conversations we've never had, predictions written in your handwriting about my death in 3 days. And now this woman appears like some forest oracle to tell us it's all psychological theater. She turned back to Elena with desperate intensity. But you can't prove it, can you? You can't guarantee that walking away means safety. No, Elena admitted quietly. I can't. The only way to truly know would be to test it. Maggie felt something crystallizing inside her, a decision forming with the inexorable weight of falling stone. To go back on September 25th at exactly 3:47 p.m. and see what happens when I sit in that chair. Absolutely not. Harold's voice carried an authority she'd rarely heard in their decades together. I won't let you sacrifice yourself to satisfy some intellectual compulsion. We're going home. We're calling this what it is, a psychological break triggered by stress and anniversary emotions, and we're getting you help. The patronizing tone ignited something fierce in Maggie's chest. Let me. Harold, I've spent 37 years being your dutiful wife, organizing our life around your preferences, your schedule, your need for domestic tranquility. If this is predetermined, if I'm truly going to die in 3 days, then maybe for once I want to choose how I face it instead of hiding behind comfortable illusions. This isn't about control, Maggie. This is about love. His voice broke on the word. I can't lose you to some cosmic game where the only way to win is to refuse to play. Elena watched their confrontation with the patient attention of someone accustomed to witnessing human drama unfold in the forest's timeless theater. The memory house has claimed 17 people in my lifetime, she said finally. Not through supernatural murder, but through exactly this, the need to know for certain, the compulsion to test fate. They convince themselves that walking into the trap will somehow free them from it. Or maybe, Maggie countered, they died because they accepted your explanation instead of demanding truth. Maybe the real tragedy is people walking away from the most important question they'll ever face because some well-meaning stranger convinced them that ignorance is safety. The sound of rushing water grew louder in the distance, and Maggie felt it calling to her like a siren song. She could picture herself, in 3 days, sitting in that moss-covered cabin at 3:47 p.m., finally learning whether human consciousness was real or illusion, whether love transcended predestination or was simply another elegant lie. Harold reached for her hands, and she let him take them, feeling the familiar calluses on his palms from decades of shared labor. What if I go with you? He said desperately. What if we face whatever's in that cabin together? The journal said you'd try to stop me, that you'd beg me not to go. It said you'd follow me and find my body at sunset. Maggie's voice was eerily calm now, as if she were discussing someone else's fate. If we're testing whether it's true, then changing the variables would invalidate the experiment. Elena stepped closer, her weathered face creased with something that might have been pity. Child, you're not a scientist observing natural phenomena. You're a human being whose marriage and sanity are being threatened by forces designed to exploit your deepest vulnerabilities. The experiment is already contaminated by your participation in it. But Maggie was no longer listening to either of them. Her attention had turned inward, to the terrible certainty growing in her chest that she would return to the cabin in 3 days, that she would discover once and for all whether choice was real or illusion, and that neither love nor logic would be enough to save her from the truth she was determined to uncover. The 3 days passed like a fever dream, each hour marked by Harold's increasingly desperate attempts to break through Maggie's obsession. He hid their car keys, unplugged their phones, even suggested they drive to Seattle and check into a hotel until the prophesied date passed. But Maggie moved through their house like a woman underwater, mechanically sorting through decades of accumulated life while her mind remained fixed on that moss-covered cabin and the terrible appointment waiting for her there. On the morning of September 25th, she woke before dawn with crystalline clarity. Harold lay beside her, his breathing shallow and irregular. He'd barely slept since their return from the forest, spending his nights watching her as if his vigilance alone could anchor her to the world of the living. She studied his familiar face in the gray light, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the silver stubble he'd forgotten to shave, the mouth that had spoken words of love for 37 years. "I know you're awake," he said without opening his eyes. "I'm going, Harold." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "At 3 o'clock, I'm driving back to that cabin." He sat up then, his hair wild, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "The woman, Elena, she gave me her phone number. She's been trying to reach you, wants to show you something that might change your mind." "Nothing will change my mind." Maggie rose from bed with fluid grace, already reaching for the clothes she'd laid out the night before. "I've spent 3 days analyzing this from every possible angle. If the prophecy is false, I'll sit in that chair, nothing will happen, and we'll drive home to resume our ordinary life with extraordinary knowledge. If it's true—" She paused, her hand stilling on the blue cotton dress that had always been Harold's favorite. "Then at least I'll face death with my eyes open instead of living in terror of predetermined fate." "And what about me?" The raw pain in his voice almost broke her resolve. "What about the man who loves you more than his own life, who's supposed to find your body at sunset? If this is really about choice, then choose to stay alive. Choose our marriage over your need to know." Maggie turned to face him fully, and for a moment, the terrible certainty wavered. Here was Harold at his most human, not the figure from the journals, not a player in some cosmic script, but the man who'd held her through flu and grief and ordinary Tuesday mornings for more than half her life. The man who was begging her to choose love over knowledge, safety over truth. "I can't," she whispered, and the admission felt like tearing something vital from her chest. "Harold, I can't live knowing that every choice might be illusion, that every moment of happiness might be predetermined theater. The uncertainty is killing me more slowly than any prophecy could." She dressed in silence while he watched, his face cycling through anger and despair, and a kind of broken acceptance. When she reached for her purse, he stood abruptly. "Then I'm coming with you." "No." The word came out sharp, final. The journal was very specific about what happens if you try to interfere. "You follow me, you find my body, you live the rest of your life knowing you couldn't save me. If there's even a chance that's predetermined, I won't risk making you complicit in my destruction." Harold moved toward her, but she stepped back, maintaining distance between them like a physical barrier. "This is exactly what it wants," he said desperately. "Can't you see? The cabin, the memory house, whatever force is behind this, it's counting on your compulsion to know, your inability to accept uncertainty. You're walking into a trap disguised as enlightenment. Maybe." Maggie picked up her car keys, their weight familiar and foreign in her palm. "But what if the real trap is spending the rest of my life wondering? What if the cruelest fate isn't death, but endless doubt about whether consciousness is real or love is possible?" She walked toward the door of their bedroom, the room where they'd made love and shared dreams and built the quiet intimacy that had sustained them through decades of ordinary days. Behind her, she heard Harold's breathing become ragged, heard the sound of a man watching his world collapse. "I love you," she said without turning around. "Whether that love is scripted or chosen, predetermined or free, it's the most real thing I've ever known. Remember that, if everything else turns out to be illusion." The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel, each step carrying her closer to the moment when she would learn whether human beings possessed souls or were simply biological machines following invisible programming. At 3:47 p.m., she would sit in that moss-covered chair and discover the truth that lurked beneath the surface of existence. Behind her, Harold called her name one final time, his voice breaking on the syllables that had shaped her identity for 37 years. But Maggie was already crossing the threshold into whatever waited beyond the comfortable boundaries of their shared life, stepping toward revelation or destruction with the terrible courage of someone who preferred certainty to hope. The drive through the Olympic Peninsula felt like moving through a landscape that existed outside normal time, each familiar landmark transformed into something ominous and strange. Maggie gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her blue dress wrinkled from the nervous perspiration that had begun the moment she'd left Harold standing in their doorway, like a man watching his wife descend into madness. At 3:15 p.m., She parked at the trailhead where their anniversary hike had begun 4 days ago. The forest waited with the patient hunger of something that had always known she would return. Her phone buzzed insistently, Harold's 15th call since she'd left home, but she turned it off and slipped it into her glove compartment. Whatever happened in the next hour would happen without witnesses, without the possibility of rescue or intervention. The path to the hidden cabin revealed itself with disturbing ease, as if the moss and undergrowth had rearranged themselves to guide her toward her appointment with destiny. Each step felt predetermined yet chosen, scripted yet authentic, until the very act of walking became a metaphor for the philosophical prison that had consumed her thoughts for 3 days. Was her foot falling in this exact spot because she'd willed it there, or because some cosmic force had always intended for her to follow this precise trajectory toward revelation or destruction? At 3:41 p.m., she emerged into the clearing where the moss-covered cabin sat like a patient tumor in the forest's green flesh. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. From within came that sound again, the subtle scratching of pen on paper, as if invisible hands were still writing her story in real time, adjusting the narrative to accommodate her arrival. Maggie approached the door with the mechanical precision of a woman fulfilling a contract written in her own blood. The burgundy journal lay open on the moss-covered table exactly where they'd left it, but now additional pages had been filled with Harold's familiar handwriting. Her hands trembled as she read the new entries. September 22nd. Maggie is obsessed with returning to the cabin. I've tried everything to dissuade her, but she's convinced that testing the prophecy is the only way to reclaim her agency. She doesn't understand that she's already lost her free will to the compulsion for absolute knowledge. September 24th. Tomorrow she dies. I can see it in her eyes, a terrible peace that comes from surrendering to fate while calling it choice. The cruelest irony is that she'll enter that cabin believing she's asserting her independence when she's actually fulfilling the most predictable script imaginable, the brilliant woman who thinks she can outwit destiny through rational analysis. September 25th, 3:47 p.m. She's sitting in the chair now. I wonder if she understands, in these final moments, that the real trap was never predestination versus free will. The real trap was the assumption that those categories were meaningful distinctions rather than different names for the same fundamental mystery. Maggie's vision blurred as she read these words that Harold couldn't possibly have written. Harold, who was at home, 20 miles away, probably calling the police or racing toward the forest in desperate violation of her explicit instructions. Yet here was his handwriting, documenting her actions in present tense, describing thoughts she was having at the very moment she was having them. She looked at her watch. 3:47 p.m. exactly. The moss-covered chair waited with the patient inevitability of gravity itself. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about psychological manipulation, about elaborate hoaxes designed to exploit her scholarly obsessions and existential anxieties. But another part, deeper, darker, infinitely curious, whispered that truth lay just beyond the act of sitting down, just past the moment of surrender to whatever force had orchestrated this impossible convergence of prophecy and reality. As she lowered herself into the chair, Maggie felt the moss beneath her fingertips pulse with warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. The cabin walls seemed to breathe around her, expanding and contracting like the interior of some vast organism that had been digesting human consciousness for decades. The journal's pages fluttered without wind, revealing entries dated years into the future, documenting Harold's slow descent into madness after her death, his eventual suicide on their 40th anniversary, the way their house would stand empty until developers demolished it to build condominiums. The scratching of invisible pens grew louder, more insistent, until it filled her skull like the sound of termites eating through the foundations of reality itself. And in that moment of absolute horror, Maggie understood with crystalline clarity that she had walked willingly into something far worse than death. She had surrendered her agency to the very force she'd hoped to defeat, chosen predestination while believing she was asserting free will. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was her own hand reaching for a pen that materialized from nowhere. already moving to write the words that would complete the prophecy she'd been fulfilling from the moment she'd first stepped into this cursed clearing. The pen felt warm in her fingers, impossibly familiar, as if she'd been holding it her entire life. Maggie watched her hand move across the page with horrified fascination, the words flowing in handwriting she recognized as her own. "I understand now. The cabin isn't a place, it's a state of consciousness. The memory house Elena spoke of isn't contained within these moss-covered walls. It exists in the space between knowing and not knowing, in the terrible human need to transform mystery into certainty." Her voice joined the scratching symphony, speaking the words as she wrote them, though she had no conscious intention of doing either. Harold was right. I've been performing predetermined actions while convincing myself I was making choices, but that's not the revelation that freezes my blood. The darkness around her shifted, revealing that the cabin's interior had transformed into something vast and impossible. The walls stretched into infinity, lined with countless journals, each one documenting a different couple's discovery of this place. Thousands of moss-covered chairs arranged in perfect rows, each one occupied by a figure writing frantically in burgundy books. The scratching sound she'd been hearing wasn't coming from invisible pens. It was the collective sound of every soul who had ever sought absolute truth and found something far more terrifying. The real horror, her hand continued writing, is not that free will is an illusion. The real horror is that it's completely real, and I've used mine to trap myself in the very prison I sought to escape. Maggie felt her consciousness expanding, touching the awareness of every other occupant in this impossible space. She saw Elena, not as the forest guide she'd appeared to be, but as another seeker who had entered the memory house decades ago, convinced she could help others avoid her fate. Elena's physical body had been found by hikers in 1987, but her consciousness remained trapped here, playing the role of wise counselor to each new couple who stumbled upon the cabin's threshold. "Every choice I made was freely chosen," Maggie heard herself say, her voice echoing through the infinite chamber. "My obsession with order, my fear of abandonment, my compulsion to know rather than simply accept uncertainty. No cosmic force predetermined my responses. They emerged naturally from the person I'd spent 62 years becoming." She saw Harold clearly now, not as he appeared in their ordinary life, but as the man who had loved her so completely that he'd unconsciously shaped himself into exactly the kind of puzzle she'd be compelled to solve. His future letters, his prescient knowledge, his uncanny ability to fulfill prophecies, none of it was supernatural predestination. It was the inevitable result of a personality so attuned to her needs and fears that he'd become the perfect key to unlock her deepest vulnerabilities. "The memory house doesn't create the future," her hand wrote with increasing urgency. "It reveals the logical conclusion of who we already are. Harold's letters exist because his love for me is so complete, so mathematically precise, that every word he'll ever speak to me already exists in potential, waiting for the proper emotional catalyst to bring it into manifestation." The terrible beauty of it struck her like lightning illuminating a midnight landscape. Their entire marriage hadn't been scripted by external forces. It had been an improvisation so perfectly choreographed by two people learning to love each other that it had achieved the appearance of predestination. Harold's ability to speak words that matched future letters wasn't supernatural prophecy. It was the natural result of a man who had spent 37 years studying every nuance of her emotional responses. "I created this prison," she whispered, and felt the admission resonate through the infinite chamber. Not through supernatural influence or cosmic manipulation, but through the perfectly human choice to prioritize knowledge over love, certainty over trust, intellectual satisfaction over the messy ambiguity of real relationship. Around her, the other trapped consciousness nodded in recognition. Each had made the same fundamental error, mistaking the need to understand love for love itself, confusing the map of intimacy with the actual territory of sharing life with another imperfect human being. "The way out," her hand wrote with sudden desperate clarity, "isn't through more knowledge or deeper analysis. The way out is through the one choice I've been avoiding since the moment I found the first journal, accepting that some mysteries are more beautiful unsolved that love doesn't require understanding to be real. But even as she wrote these words, Maggie felt the terrible irony of her situation crystallizing. She had gained perfect understanding of her predicament through the very compulsion that had created it. She could see the solution with absolute clarity, but reaching for it would require abandoning the intellectual certainty that had become her identity. The pen trembled in her fingers as she faced the final choice, not between predetermined fate and free will, but between the safety of comprehensive knowledge and the terrifying freedom of deliberate ignorance, between staying trapped in perfect understanding or releasing herself into the beautiful uncertainty of genuine love. "Harold," she wrote, and felt 37 years of authentic devotion burning through the elaborate philosophical prison she'd constructed around their marriage. "Harold," she wrote, and the name became an incantation that pierced through the infinite chamber of trapped consciousness like a blade of pure warmth. The pen in her hand began to shake violently as competing forces warred within her, the scholarly need to understand completely and the deeper recognition that love had never required her comprehension to exist. "I choose mystery," she said aloud, her voice cutting through the symphony of scratching pens. "I choose the unknown. I choose Harold over understanding Harold." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The burgundy journal burst into flames that felt like ice against her fingers, and the infinite chamber began to collapse inward like a dying star. Around her, the other trapped souls looked up from their endless writing with expressions of desperate hope and terror. "How?" Elena's voice reached her across the dissolving space. "How do you abandon the compulsion that defines you?" Maggie stood from the moss-covered chair, feeling 37 years of accumulated certainty crumbling beneath her feet. "By remembering that love isn't a problem to be solved, it's a gift to be received." The walls of the memory house shuddered and began to crack. Through the fissures, she glimpsed something impossible. Sunlight streaming through ordinary forest canopy, the simple reality of Douglas firs and sword ferns that existed without requiring analysis or interpretation. The sound of footsteps crashing through underbrush, growing closer. "Maggie!" Harold's voice, raw with panic and desperation, cutting through the philosophical maze she'd constructed. "Maggie, where are you?" But she wasn't trapped anymore. The realization struck her with stunning simplicity. She had never been physically taken anywhere. Her body still sat in the moss-covered chair in the real cabin, while her consciousness had become lost in the labyrinth of her own making. The memory house, the infinite chamber, the thousands of trapped souls, all of it was the projection of a mind that had chosen analysis over acceptance, understanding over faith. "I'm here," she called out, and her voice emerged from her physical throat in the real world. "Harold, I'm here!" The sound of running footsteps grew closer, accompanied by Harold's voice, shouting her name with the desperate repetition of a man who had driven 20 miles in 15 minutes, abandoning every promise he'd made about respecting her choice. He burst through the cabin door like a force of nature, his face wild with terror and relief. "Thank God," he gasped, dropping to his knees beside the moss-covered chair. "I found you just sitting here, staring at nothing. You've been like this for 20 minutes. Maggie looked down at her hands. The burgundy journal lay open before her, but the pages were blank except for a single line in her own handwriting. "Some mysteries are more beautiful unsolved. The letters," she whispered, "your future letters. Where are they?" Harold's expression shifted to gentle confusion. "What letters?" "Maggie, there never were any letters. The journal we found was completely empty except for dates. Everything else, we must have imagined it, or projected it, or—" He touched her face with trembling fingers. "I don't know what happened here. I don't think I want to know." And in that moment, Maggie felt the final piece of her philosophical prison crumble away. Harold was right. There had been no supernatural letters, no cosmic predestination, no elaborate metaphysical conspiracy. There had only been two people who loved each other so completely that her terror of losing him had manifested as an elaborate psychological construct designed to test that love's authenticity. "Neither do I," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I don't want to know." She stood from the chair and walked into Harold's embrace, feeling his solid warmth anchor her to the simple reality of their shared life. Around them, the cabin remained exactly what it had always been, a forgotten structure slowly being reclaimed by the forest, containing nothing more mysterious than moss and time and the ordinary magic of two people choosing each other day after day for 37 years. "Let's go home," she whispered against his shoulder. As they walked away from the cabin together, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the profound peace of deliberate ignorance. She didn't understand the mechanisms of love, couldn't explain the mystery of consciousness, had no answers for the eternal questions about free will and fate and the nature of human choice. And for the first time in her adult life, that uncertainty felt like freedom instead of failure. Behind them, the forest began its patient work of erasing even the memory of their passage, returning the moss-covered cabin to its quiet solitude where it would wait, empty and meaningless and perfectly ordinary, for the next seeker who mistook the need to know everything for the courage to love anything. Harold's hand found hers as they walked toward their car, toward home, toward the beautiful uncertainty of whatever came next. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, Harold's hand resting on Maggie's knee as familiar landscapes rolled past their windows. She watched the Olympic Peninsula's dense forests give way to cleared farmland, then suburban developments, feeling each mile distance her from the moss-covered cabin and its terrible invitation to certainty. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden hues that seemed almost impossibly vivid after the dim interior of that forgotten place. But as they pulled into their driveway, Maggie felt a familiar stirring of unease. The house looked exactly as they'd left it that morning. Harold's reading glasses on the porch table beside yesterday's crossword, her gardening gloves draped over the railing. Yet something felt fundamentally altered, not in the physical world, but in her perception of it. "I need to check something," she said quietly as they climbed the front steps. Harold paused with his key halfway to the lock. "Maggie," we agreed. "No more seeking answers, no more—" "Not about the cabin," she interrupted. "About us. About what happens now." Inside, she moved through their home with the careful attention of an archaeologist examining artifacts from a vanished civilization. 37 years of shared life surrounded her. Harold's coffee mug with the chip on the handle that she'd never had the heart to throw away. Her collection of literary criticism arranged by publication date. The wedding photo on the mantel where they both looked impossibly young and certain about their future together. Each object felt like evidence of something she couldn't quite name. Not supernatural predestination, not cosmic manipulation, but something equally profound, the accumulated weight of countless small choices that had woven their separate lives into an indivisible whole. Harold choosing her favorite tea without being asked, her learning to appreciate his terrible puns, the gradual unconscious choreography of two people learning to move through shared space without collision. "What are you looking for?" Harold asked, following her into the kitchen. Maggie opened the drawer where she kept important papers, insurance documents, birth certificates, their marriage license. Her fingers moved with automatic precision to a manila folder she'd labeled personal correspondence decades ago. Inside were Harold's actual letters, notes he'd left her during business trips, birthday cards with his handwriting, the awkward romantic poem he'd written for their 10th anniversary. She spread them across the kitchen table and stared at the familiar script. These were the real documents of their marriage. Imperfect, spontaneous, gloriously human expressions of love that contained no prophetic knowledge, no supernatural insight, just Harold trying to communicate feelings that were too large for words, making the same spelling mistakes he'd been making since she'd known him. "This is what I needed to see," she said, touching the edges of the papers. "Proof that what we have is messier and more beautiful than any predetermined script could ever be." Harold sat across from her, his expression troubled. "But it doesn't feel like proof to you, does it? It feels like evidence that you might be wrong, that maybe the cabin's revelations were real and this is just—" He gestured helplessly at the ordinary domesticity surrounding them, just the aftermath of choosing ignorance over truth. The accusation hung between them like a physical presence. Maggie felt her scholarly instincts awakening, the familiar hunger for certainty that had driven her to the cabin in the first place. Part of her wanted to return immediately, to demand definitive answers about the nature of free will and predestination, to solve the mystery of consciousness through pure intellectual force. But a deeper part recognized this impulse as the very trap she'd spent the afternoon escaping. "You're right," she admitted. "It doesn't feel like proof. It feels like a choice I have to keep making, moment by moment for the rest of our lives. The choice to trust that love doesn't require understanding to be real." Harold reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "And if that choice becomes unbearable, if the uncertainty drives you back to seeking absolute answers?" Maggie looked into his eyes and saw her own fears reflected there. They both understood that today's revelation wouldn't be permanent, that the compulsion for certainty would reassert itself in quieter moments, whispering that she'd abandoned truth for the comfort of willful delusion. The battle between analysis and acceptance wasn't won. It was simply acknowledged as the ongoing condition of being human. "Then we'll face that together," she said. "But right now, in this moment, I choose the mystery of you over the solution of you. I choose the question of us over the answer of us." As if summoned by her words, the phone rang. Harold moved to answer it, and Maggie heard him speaking to someone about a missing persons report, explaining that they'd found each other, that everything was fine now. Through the kitchen window, she watched evening light fade from their garden, transforming familiar shapes into something temporary and precious. Tomorrow would bring new uncertainties, fresh opportunities to choose knowledge over faith or faith over knowledge. But tonight, she would practice the discipline of deliberate mystery, learning to love the questions themselves rather than demanding they resolve into answers. The cabin waited in the forest, patient and empty, ready to offer certainty to the next seeker who confused the need to understand everything with the courage to love anything at all. The phone's echo had barely faded when Maggie felt it, a tremor in the fabric of the choice she'd just made. Not supernatural, not mystical, but devastatingly human. The return of doubt like a tide she thought she'd permanently turned back. Harold hung up and turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral in the way she'd learned to recognize over 37 years. He was waiting, she realized, for her to change her mind, expecting it, perhaps even preparing himself for the moment she would announce they needed to return to the cabin, needed to know for certain what was real and what was projection. "The officer said they had reports of an abandoned car near the trailhead," Harold said quietly. "People get lost up there more often than anyone admits." Maggie nodded, but her attention had already fractured. Through the kitchen window, their garden was dissolving into evening shadows, each familiar plant becoming an abstract shape that could be anything, could mean anything. The uncertainty she'd embraced just moments ago now felt like standing at the edge of an abyss with no way to measure its depth. What if choosing mystery is just another form of cowardice? The thought struck with surgical precision. What if the real courage would be returning to face whatever truth the cabin contains? Her hands began to shake. The letters Harold had actually written, spread across their kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene, suddenly looked staged, carefully arranged to support a narrative she wanted to believe. How easy it would be to doubt their authenticity, to suspect they'd been planted by the same force that had created those prophetic journals. "Maggie," Harold's voice cut through the spiral of her thoughts. "I can see it happening. You're building the maze again." "I'm not," she started, then stopped, because she was. With every passing second, her mind was constructing elaborate frameworks of possibility, each more Byzantine than the last. The cabin could be testing her commitment to ignorance. Her choice to leave could have been the predetermined response all along. The very act of choosing mystery might be the most sophisticated form of manipulation yet. "This is what Elena meant," she whispered. "This is why no one ever really escapes." Harold moved closer, but didn't touch her. "Elena?" "The guide. The woman who—" Maggie paused, trying to remember. Had there been a guide? The memory felt simultaneously vivid and uncertain, like trying to recall a dream after waking. "I thought someone was helping me understand, but maybe that was part of it too. Maybe every moment of clarity was designed to make this doubt more devastating." The kitchen began to feel enormous and claustrophobic simultaneously. Every object, Harold's coffee mug, her carefully organized spice rack, the grocery list magneted to the refrigerator, seemed to mock the possibility of genuine domesticity. How could ordinary life continue when she couldn't trust the foundation of her own perceptions? "I need to go back," she heard herself say. "No." Harold's response was immediate and final. "I won't let you." The words hit her like a physical blow. In 37 years of marriage, Harold had never forbidden her anything. His sudden authoritarianism felt like proof that everything had changed, that the man she'd thought she knew was revealing capabilities that had been hidden until this moment of crisis. "You can't stop me," she said, moving toward the car keys. Harold stepped between her and the door. His face had transformed into something she didn't recognize, not angry, but absolutely immovable. "Watch me." The standoff stretched between them like a chasm. Maggie felt every certainty she'd ever held about their relationship crumbling in real time. This was the moment she'd always feared would come, when Harold's unlimited patience would finally exhaust itself, when the gentle man she'd married would reveal the controlling nature that surely lurked beneath his surface kindness. "You see?" she said, her voice rising. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You've been hiding parts of yourself, manipulating situations to seem like the perfect husband, and now when I need answers, you're—" "Maggie, stop." Harold's voice was gentle again, which somehow made everything worse. "Listen to yourself. You're creating the very prison you're trying to escape. You're writing the story where I become the villain because you can't tolerate not knowing how the story ends." The accusation hung in the air between them. Maggie felt her consciousness splitting, part of her observing with horrified fascination as she constructed elaborate paranoid scenarios from the simplest interactions. Harold refusing to let her return to the cabin became evidence of a conspiracy. His gentleness became proof of manipulation. His knowledge of her psychological patterns became supernatural prescience. "I'm doing it again," she whispered. "Yes. How do I stop?" Harold moved closer, his movements careful and deliberate. "By choosing right now, in this moment, to trust what you know instead of what you fear. Not trust in cosmic mysteries or predetermined fates, but trust in the observable evidence of 37 years. Maggie looked into his eyes and saw something that cut through every elaborate theory her mind had constructed: simple human exhaustion. Harold was afraid too, not of supernatural forces or cosmic manipulation, but of watching the woman he loved disappear into intellectual labyrinths of her own making. "Help me," she said, and the real test began. Harold's hands found her shoulders, his touch grounding her in physical reality even as her mind continued its frantic spiral. "Tell me what you're actually afraid of," he said, "not the cosmic forces or predetermined scripts. What are you really afraid of, Maggie?" The question cut through 37 years of accumulated defenses. Standing in their kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of ordinary life, Maggie felt the elaborate philosophical frameworks she'd constructed begin to collapse, revealing the raw terror beneath. "I'm afraid that if I stop analyzing everything, stop trying to understand how love works, it will disappear," she whispered, like it was never real at all. "And I'm afraid," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly, "that your need to understand everything will destroy the very thing you're trying to preserve." The confession hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Maggie saw with sudden clarity how her intellectual hunger had been consuming their marriage from the inside, not through supernatural predestination, but through the grinding daily erosion of choosing analysis over presence, understanding over faith. "The cabin," she said slowly. "It wasn't showing me some cosmic truth about free will. It was showing me what happens when someone needs to solve love instead of living it." Harold nodded, tears streaming down his face. "You've been so afraid of losing me that you've spent years documenting our relationship instead of experiencing it, cataloging every gesture, analyzing every conversation, building theories about the mechanics of human affection as if love were a machine you could take apart and reassemble." The accusation should have felt like an attack, but instead, it landed like relief. Everything she'd interpreted as supernatural manipulation had been the projection of her own deepest fear. That love without complete understanding was vulnerable to sudden disappearance. She'd been so terrified of losing Harold that she'd gradually replaced him with her theories about him. "Show me how to stop," she said. Harold's response was wordless. He pulled her into his arms with the desperate intensity of a man who had been watching his wife disappear into abstractions for decades. But this wasn't the gentle, careful embrace she'd grown accustomed to. This was raw human need, unfiltered by her tendency to analyze the gesture's psychological significance. "Don't think about why I'm holding you," he whispered against her hair. "Don't catalog the pressure of my arms or theorize about attachment patterns. Just feel me holding you." Maggie tried to comply, but her mind immediately began its familiar cataloging. The slight tremor in Harold's hands that suggested emotional overwhelm, the way he was breathing that indicated. She forced herself to stop, to simply exist within the embrace without dissecting it. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, she succeeded. She felt Harold's warmth, the solid reality of his chest against her cheek, the particular smell of his aftershave mixed with garden soil. No analysis, no framework, just pure sensation. Then the doubt crept back. Was this moment of presence real, or was she performing presence to convince herself she'd changed? Was Harold holding her differently now, or was she projecting difference onto familiar gestures? The questions multiplied like viruses, each spawning new uncertainties. "I can't do it," she gasped, pulling away. "I can't stop thinking about thinking." "Then don't stop," Harold said, surprising her. "But think about this. What if the content of your thoughts matters less than what you choose to do while you're thinking them?" He took her hand and led her to the kitchen table where his real letters still lay scattered. "You spent the afternoon convinced that love requires either perfect understanding or blind faith. But look at these." Maggie looked down at Harold's actual handwriting. Messy, imperfect, achingly human, a birthday card where he'd misspelled beautiful, a note apologizing for forgetting to buy milk signed "Your devoted fool," a longer letter from his only business trip where he'd tried and failed to articulate how much he missed the sound of her voice. "These aren't the products of someone who understands love," Harold continued. "They're the products of someone stumbling through love, making mistakes, trying anyway, failing to find the right words and writing the wrong ones, because silence felt worse." Maggie picked up the birthday card, studying Harold's crossed-out attempts at romantic sentiment. He'd written, "You make me a better man," then scratched it out. "Tried my heart belongs to you," then abandoned that too. Finally settled on "Happy birthday to my favorite human being" in handwriting that looked frustrated with its own inadequacy. "You were never predetermined," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You were always just trying. And failing spectacularly half the time," Harold admitted. "The cabin didn't show you prophecies, Maggie. It showed you the fantasy of perfect love. Love that never doubts itself, never makes mistakes, never has to choose faith over certainty." Maggie felt something fundamental shift in her chest. The battle wasn't between free will and predestination, between analysis and ignorance. It was between the terror of imperfect love and the courage to embrace love's essential imperfection. "I choose the mess," she said quietly. "I choose not knowing if we're making the right choices, as long as we're making them together." Harold smiled through his tears. "Even when I forget to buy milk?" "Especially then." The moment hung between them like something fragile and essential, but Maggie felt the familiar tug of her analytical mind already dissecting what had just happened. Even now, choosing mess over certainty, she caught herself cataloging the relief in Harold's expression, measuring the weight of their shared understanding. "I have to tell you something," she said, her voice barely audible. "Even now, even choosing this, I can feel myself trying to turn it into another theory, another framework to understand, the need to analyze everything. It's not just going to disappear because I've made a decision." Harold's smile faded, replaced by something deeper and more complex. "I know. You know? Maggie, I've watched you build intellectual mazes around every important moment of our marriage for 37 years. Our wedding day, you spent analyzing the sociology of marriage traditions instead of experiencing them. When your mother died, you researched grief patterns instead of grieving. When we couldn't have children, you turned it into a study of reproductive psychology rather than mourning what we'd lost. Each example hit like a physical blow. Maggie saw herself through Harold's eyes for the first time, not as a woman seeking understanding, but as someone who had systematically replaced experience with analysis, emotion with framework, living with studying life. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because I thought if I was patient enough, loving enough, you'd eventually feel safe enough to stop needing to understand everything. Harold's voice carried the weight of decades. I thought your need to analyze was temporary, a phase you'd outgrow when you trusted our love completely. The revelation cracked something open in Maggie's chest, but it never went away. It got worse. Every year, you needed more evidence, more proof, more understanding of how love works, until finally, he gestured helplessly at the scattered letters, until you couldn't just love me anymore. You had to solve me. Maggie felt the true cost of her intellectual hunger, materializing with devastating clarity. She hadn't just been analyzing their marriage, she'd been gradually erasing it, replacing Harold with her theories about Harold, substituting lived experience with documented evidence. The cabin showed me a version of us where everything was predetermined, she said slowly, because that's exactly what I've been trying to create. A version of love where uncertainty is eliminated, where I could finally understand everything completely. And what would that have cost us? The answer came without hesitation. Everything that makes love real. Harold nodded, but his expression remained troubled. So what now? You can't just decide to stop being who you are, Maggie. Your mind will keep building frameworks, keep seeking patterns, keep trying to solve what can't be solved. The truth of it settled over her like a weight. This wasn't a problem that could be resolved through revelation or choice. Her need to understand everything was as fundamental to her nature as Harold's gentleness was to his. She could choose to fight it, but the fighting would become another form of self-analysis, another maze of consciousness examining consciousness. Then I have to sacrifice something, she said quietly. What do you mean? Maggie looked around their kitchen, seeing it with new eyes. Every detail reflected her need for order, understanding, control. The precisely organized spice rack, the carefully labeled storage containers, the filing system for their important papers, the detailed calendar tracking their activities, anniversaries, obligations. I have to give up the fantasy that understanding and living are the same thing, she said. I have to sacrifice the belief that if I can't explain something completely, it might disappear. She moved to the drawer where she kept her notebooks, years of careful documentation about their relationship, her attempts to decode the patterns of Harold's affection, her theories about the mechanics of successful marriage. Page after page of Harold reduced to data points, their love transformed into case study. I need to stop documenting us and start living us, she said, her hand hovering over the notebooks. But that means giving up the one thing that's made me feel safe for 37 years. Harold moved beside her, understanding the magnitude of what she was contemplating. You don't have to throw everything away, Maggie. You don't have to stop being analytical. You just have to stop making analysis more important than experience. But how do I know the difference? You don't. That's the point. The simple answer contained everything she'd been trying to escape: fundamental uncertainty about the most important aspects of human existence. She could choose to live their marriage instead of studying it, but that choice would have to be renewed constantly, moment by moment, without any guarantee that love would survive the transition from theory to practice. This is the real sacrifice, she whispered. Not giving up the notebooks, but giving up the belief that love needs to be understood to be trusted. Harold took her hand. Can you do it? Maggie looked into his eyes, not analyzing their color or expression, or what they might reveal about his emotional state, but simply meeting his gaze as one human being encountering another in a moment of irreducible complexity. I don't know, she said, but I'm willing to find out. The admission felt like stepping off the edge of everything she'd ever believed about the relationship between knowledge and security. And in that falling, she finally began to understand what faith actually meant. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. Maggie felt the weight of 37 years pressing against this single moment, decades of careful documentation, of choosing safety over spontaneity, of building walls of understanding around the very thing she was most terrified of losing. Harold squeezed her hand gently. "What does finding out look like?" The question was so practical, so quintessentially Harold, that Maggie almost laughed. Even in the midst of existential revelation, her husband was asking about implementation. But for once, instead of analyzing the psychology behind his need for concrete steps, she found herself grateful for his grounding presence. "I don't know," she said again, and the repetition felt like learning a new language. "Maybe we start with right now. This conversation. I'm not going to think about what it means that you're asking practical questions, or wonder if you're trying to manage my emotional state, or catalog this interaction for future reference." She paused, feeling the familiar tug of her analytical mind already beginning its work, then consciously chose to let the thoughts pass without engaging them. "I'm just going to sit here with you and figure out what comes next." Harold's expression shifted, surprise mixing with something that looked like relief. "You're really doing it. You're not dissecting your facial expression to determine your emotional state?" Maggie finished. "No, I'm not. Well, I am, but I'm choosing not to follow those thoughts wherever they want to take me." She stood and walked to the drawer containing her notebooks, Harold watching quietly. The leather-bound volumes represented years of careful observation, desperate attempts to crack the code of human affection. She could feel their gravitational pull, the promise that just a little more analysis might finally reveal the secret to permanent love. Instead, she closed the drawer without opening it. "I'm not throwing them away," she said, more to herself than to Harold. "But I'm not opening them right now either. I'm choosing to sit in this kitchen with my husband and not know exactly what that means." The simple act felt revolutionary. For the first time in decades, she was deliberately choosing uncertainty over understanding, presence over analysis. The discomfort was immediate and intense. Every instinct screamed that she was leaving herself vulnerable, that without constant vigilance, love would slip away like water through her fingers. But Harold was still here, still holding her hand, still looking at her with the same mixture of exhaustion and hope he'd carried for years. "How long have you been waiting for this?" she asked. "Waiting for what?" "For me to stop studying you and start seeing you." Harold considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I don't think I was waiting exactly. I think I was hoping. But I'd given up expecting it to happen. I thought maybe your way of loving, through understanding, through documentation, was just who you were. I was trying to learn to be grateful for being loved analytically instead of resenting not being loved spontaneously." The admission hit Maggie like a physical blow. Harold had been adapting to her emotional limitations for decades, learning to find warmth in her clinical attention, rather than demanding the immediate affection he craved. She'd been so focused on her own fear of losing him that she'd never considered what it might cost him to be loved like a research project. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Harold. Don't apologize for being who you are. But I am apologizing. Not for being analytical, but for making you feel like my love was conditional on understanding you completely, for making you perform being comprehensible instead of just being yourself." Harold's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "I didn't even realize that's what I was doing until right now." They sat in the growing silence of their kitchen as afternoon light slanted through windows, illuminating dust motes that danced without purpose or pattern. Maggie watched them move and felt something fundamental relax in her chest. She didn't need to understand their trajectory or predict where they would settle. Their movement was beautiful, precisely because it was purposeless. "What if we just had dinner?" she said suddenly. "Dinner? Just dinner. I'll cook, you'll tell me about your day. We'll eat food and talk about normal things. And I'll practice not turning it into data about the anthropology of domestic partnership." Harold smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him all day. "I would love to just have dinner." Maggie moved to the refrigerator and began pulling out ingredients without a plan. For 37 years, her meals had been carefully researched, nutritionally optimized, scheduled according to theories about proper domestic routine. Tonight, she was going to cook whatever seemed appealing and trust that hunger and availability were sufficient organizing principles. Harold? Yes? Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for finally coming back. The words settled around them like the first snow of winter, quiet, transformative, marking the end of one season and the uncertain beginning of another. Chapter 17, The Return. 3 weeks later, Maggie found herself standing in the exact spot where they'd first discovered the moss-covered cabin. The forest looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because she was seeing it without the desperate need to decode its mysteries. The Douglas firs still towered overhead, their canopy filtering the October light into shifting patterns of green and gold. The moss still carpeted every fallen log, every stone. But she no longer felt compelled to analyze why this place had called to them or what cosmic significance their discovery might hold. "Anything?" Harold asked, coming up beside her with 2 cups of coffee from their thermos. Maggie accepted the warm mug gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic. Nothing. Just trees being trees. The cabin was gone, or perhaps had never been there at all. They'd found only a slight depression in the earth where ancient roots had rotted away, leaving a hollow that might have suggested walls and doorways to minds desperate for patterns. Maggie studied the empty space and felt no need to solve the puzzle of its existence or absence. "I keep expecting to feel disappointed," she said. "Like we should have brought cameras this time, or marked the GPS coordinates, or done something to prove it happened. But you don't." "No, I don't." The realization surprised her with its completeness. "It happened. We found photographs of ourselves, letters you'd never written, predictions about our future. We ran through these woods terrified that our entire marriage was predetermined. And now it's gone, and somehow that feels exactly right." Harold sipped his coffee, studying her face with an expression she was learning to receive without analyzing. "You look different." "Different how?" "Present. Like you're actually here with me instead of documenting being here with me." Maggie laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. 3 weeks of practicing presence had left visible marks. She moved through their house without mentally cataloging the domestic harmony of each interaction, listened to Harold's stories without filing them away as data points about his character. The change was incomplete, inconsistent, but unmistakably real. "I still catch myself doing it," she admitted. "Yesterday, when you were reading to me, I spent 5 minutes analyzing the psychology of shared literary experiences before I remembered to just listen to the story." "But you remembered." "I remembered." The simple phrase carried the weight of revolution. That's the difference, isn't it? Not that the analytical impulses disappear, but that I can choose whether to follow them. They walked deeper into the forest, following the same path that had led them to the cabin but without destination or timeline. Maggie noticed how differently she moved through the wilderness now, not scanning for signs and portents but simply walking. Her feet found their rhythm on the soft earth. Her breathing synchronized with Harold's. When a Stellar's jay called overhead, she looked up to appreciate the flash of blue among green needles without wondering what the sighting might symbolize. "Dr. Chen called yesterday," Harold mentioned casually. "Did she?" Maggie felt the familiar tug of curiosity. Dr. Chen was her former colleague from the university, now studying anomalous psychological phenomena. 3 weeks ago, she would have spent hours theorizing about why Dr. Chen might have reached out. Now she simply waited for Harold to continue. She wanted to know if we'd be willing to participate in a study about shared delusional experiences. Apparently, there have been other reports of couples finding impossible things in this forest. The information landed without triggering Maggie's usual cascade of questions and theories. She acknowledged its strangeness, felt a brief flutter of scientific interest, then let both responses settle without pursuing either. "What did you tell her?" "That we'd think about it." Harold glanced at her sideways. "What do you think?" Maggie considered the question, not as an intellectual puzzle requiring analysis, but as a practical decision requiring choice. Did she want to transform their experience into research data? Did understanding what had happened to them matter more than living with the mystery? "I think," she said slowly, "that some things are more important as experiences than as evidence." Harold's smile was radiant. 3 weeks ago, you would have been planning the methodology before I finished asking. 3 weeks ago, I thought love required documentation to survive. Maggie stopped walking and turned to face her husband fully. I spent 37 years trying to prove our marriage was real by studying it instead of living it. The cabin didn't show us prophecies, Harold. It showed me the logical endpoint of my own thinking, a world where everything was predetermined because I'd finally succeeded in analyzing away every trace of spontaneity. Harold reached for her hand, and she took it without calculating the gesture's significance. And now? Now I choose the mess. I choose not knowing if we're making the right decisions, as long as we're making them together. I choose trusting that love doesn't need to be understood to be real. They stood together in the quiet forest, surrounded by mysteries they would never solve, and Maggie felt more certain of their marriage than she had in decades. Chapter 18, The New Beginning. "Should we head back?" Harold asked, after they'd stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, but his voice carried no urgency. He was simply offering a choice, not managing their timeline. Maggie squeezed his hand. "Not yet. Let's walk a little further." They continued deeper into the forest, following deer paths that meandered between massive tree trunks without any apparent logic. 6 months ago, Maggie would have researched the migration patterns that created these trails, would have wondered about the ecological relationships governing their placement. Now she simply appreciated how the narrow pathway invited them to walk single file, Harold leading, his familiar gait setting a rhythm she could follow without thought. "I've been thinking about retirement," Harold said over his shoulder. Oh. The old Maggie would have immediately begun calculating their financial readiness, analyzing the psychological implications of his timing, wondering if this decision connected to their forest experience. The new Maggie, still becoming herself, just listened. "Not immediately, but maybe in a couple years. I keep imagining us having whole days with no schedule, no obligations. Time to figure out who we are when we're not being productive." They emerged into a small clearing where afternoon light created a natural cathedral, and Maggie felt her heart lift without needing to understand why beauty moved her. "That sounds wonderful. Does it? You're not worried about having too much unstructured time?" She laughed, recognizing how well he knew her patterns. "I'm sure I'll try to organize our leisure time into optimal categories of fulfillment, but maybe you can help me remember that some of the best moments can't be planned." Harold stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression soft with something that looked like wonder. "You really are different." "We're different," she corrected. "You're not performing being comprehensible anymore. I watched you decide to mention retirement just now, saw you choose to share the thought instead of editing it for my consumption first." He blinked in surprise. "You're right. I didn't even notice I was doing that. 37 years of habit don't disappear overnight. For either of us." Maggie sat down on a moss-covered log and patted the space beside her. "But we're learning new patterns, together." Harold settled beside her, their shoulders touching. Around them, the forest continued its ancient rhythms, invisible mycorrhizal networks sharing resources between trees, decomposition feeding new growth, cycles of light and shadow marking time in ways that had nothing to do with human understanding. Maggie let the complexity wash over her without trying to grasp it. "I used to think marriage was like a mathematical proof," she said quietly. "Something you could demonstrate was true through careful documentation and logical analysis. I thought if I just gathered enough evidence, I could prove we belong together permanently. And now? Now I think marriage is more like this forest. It exists whether or not we understand how it works. It changes constantly while remaining fundamentally itself. And trying to control it would destroy exactly what makes it beautiful." Harold leaned against her, solid and warm. "That might be the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "Really?" Maggie turned to study his face, not to analyze his expression, but because she loved looking at him. 40 years of marriage had carved gentle lines around his eyes, had silvered his hair, had deepened his voice with decades of laughter and conversation. These changes weren't data points about aging, they were the visible accumulation of their shared time, beautiful precisely because they couldn't be reversed or optimized. Really. Because you're not trying to solve romance, you're just being romantic. They sat together as the light shifted around them, and Maggie marveled at how full the silence felt. No anxiety about whether they were connecting properly, no mental cataloging of the moment's significance, just two people who had chosen each other decades ago and were choosing each other again, moment by moment, without needing to understand exactly what that choice meant. Harold? When we get home, will you read to me again? That poetry collection we started last week? Of course. Which poems do you want to hear? I don't care. Surprise me. The words came easily, naturally, though 6 months ago they would have been impossible. Maggie had spent decades trying to eliminate surprise from her life, treating uncertainty as a threat to be managed rather than a gift to be received. Now she was actively inviting the unknown, trusting that whatever Harold chose would be exactly right because he was choosing it. I love you, she said, the words carrying no agenda, requiring no response, needing no analysis. I love you too, Harold replied, and Maggie felt the simple exchange settle into her bones like a benediction. They would walk home soon, would make dinner together, would read poetry in their living room while rain began to fall outside. Tomorrow would bring its own choices, its own opportunities to practice presence over analysis, trust over control. They would probably struggle sometimes, would slip back into old patterns, would have to remember again and again how to live their love instead of studying it. But for now, in this clearing surrounded by mysteries they would never solve, Maggie felt perfectly, completely, inexplicably content.